this is Candy with eyes2jesus.blogspot.com, and welcome to this study as we're going to look at a few things in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, this video is part of my Christian Women's series. However, if this is the first video that you've seen of mine or the first video that you've seen of mine in this series, don't feel like you have to go back and watch all the previous videos in this series, but you most certainly can if you would like. And all the videos in this series are being kept in a playlist on my YouTube channel, Eyes2Jesus, and the name of that playlist is Christian Women. So I will be referencing some previous studies in this series, but if you haven't seen the previous studies, you know, my references will be detailed enough where you should be fine. And then if that piques your curiosity, then you can go look at those previous studies in the Christian Women playlist if you so desire. So I'm going to be using today the NRSVUE version of the Bible. That's a new Revised Standard Version updated edition. Came out in 2021. It is currently known as the current modern, most literal and historically accurate translation so far out, and that's pretty awesome. But as you see, there could still be some improvements, and some of these improvements are or have been made in the New Passion Translation, by the way. And some of these improvements that I'm going to talk to you about have been around for hundreds of years already in the Young's Literal Translation from the 1800s. But this is still the NRSVUE, a fabulous translation. So feel free to follow along with me in whatever Bible translation you would like, or just listen if you don't want to follow along. So I'm going to don my spectacular spectacles, and let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. We're just going to hone in on like 4 verses in this chapter. But let's do a quick overview. I'm going to tell you a quick overview of this chapter so you know what it's about. But the overview I'm going to give you is about the transitions in the chapter as we transition from one topic, and it kind of transitions and melds into another topic, etc. Okay, so verses 1 and 2 of 1 Timothy chapter 5, it talks about respect your elders or older people. Okay, so, you know, treat older people with respect, where we get our term respect your elders. And so then that kind of transitions into verses 3 through 17, which is about, speaking of respecting older people, now let's talk about widows. Now, widows have been brought up already a few times in the New Testament prior to this because, especially in the book of Acts, there was a problem. They're like, wait a minute, what do we do about widows? So they had a meeting about that. And here in chapter 5, verses 3 through 17 is probably the most extensive section in the Bible about the care of widows. And it talks about the younger widows. And we will read about what's going on with them and what's suggested to them, a problem that a lot of the younger widows had, and then the resolution to that problem. And then it talks about older widows, and it talks about that if the older widows have family to take care of them, their family is responsible for taking care of them. But if the older widows don't have any family, then it's the church's job to step up and help take care of them and care for them. And then verse 17 is a transition verse, and it transitions from widowed pastor women. Yes, we will get into that. It transitions from widowed pastor women to just respecting all church elders or pastors, male or female. That what respect is due to all of them, not just to widowed pastor women. And then we got verse 23. Verse 23 is a note to Timothy. It's not telling all of us when we have a bellyache we should drink wine. However, fermented grape juice can actually be quite helpful for certain stomach ailments. And then verse 24 is kind of a transition chapter that then transitions into chapter 6. All right, so we're going to go in first into the section that talks about the younger widows. All right, so if we take a look at verses 13 and 14, and they say, besides that, they, the younger widows, learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house. And they're not merely idle, but are also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. Now let's break these two verses down, because a lot of people will take doctrine from these verses and say, see, women are just, they just go around gossiping. So you got to keep them at home, and you got to keep them having those kids and cleaning that house and being subservient to their husband. Or they're mindless. They're senseless. They're just going to go around and gossip. Is that what the Word of God, the Bible, is actually saying here? No. And we're going to break this down, and you're going to see this very clearly. So let's break down verse 13 first. Verse 13 is the problem, and verse 14 is the resolution. So before we study the resolution to the problem, we need to understand what the problem is. All right, so besides that, they learn to be idle. So they're young widows, their husbands have passed away, they don't have a whole lot to do, right? So what do they do instead? They gad about from house to house. So they're going from house to house, all right? But it says that, and they're not merely idle. Why? Because they're going from house to house. And what are they doing from house to house? It says, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. Saying what they should not say is the key. That these young widows are going house to house and they're saying what they should not say. But what is it that they're saying that they should not say? We have two words here that tell us, but it's obscured in our English translations. The first word here is gossips. Okay, gossips is the Greek word phlueros, and it doesn't mean gossiping. Big surprise, right? It means speaking foolishness. It means to bubble about, speaking things that are not helpful, meaningless, doesn't really do anything. So a more accurate little translation would be that they are going house to house speaking foolishness. Now, this next word, in my opinion, is a controversy because it hides a very important doctrine. This next word explains the 1 Timothy 2:12 controversy. Okay? So we see that they're going house to house and that they are speaking foolish things. And then it says, and busybodies, saying what they should not say. Busybodies. That's not what the Greek word means. The Greek word that's translated busybodies in almost every Bible translation here, this is what I'm calling conspiracy. Because the Greek word underlying busybodies here is periergos. Periergos doesn't mean a busybody or a gossiper. Periergos literally means magic. So we see periergos translated correctly as magic elsewhere in the Bible. So if we turn to the book of Acts and we look at Acts chapter 19, and let's just look at the first part of that verse. Acts 19:19, the first part of that verse says, a number of those who practiced magic collected their books and burned them publicly. Now if you read this whole chapter, you see that this is taking place in Ephesus. And if you read the whole book of 1 Timothy, where is this church Timothy is working with? Ephesus. So it is not a coincidence that we have periergos only in the Bible twice. And in both places it's in Ephesus. What's the big deal about Ephesus? Well, Ephesus was the capital of Artemis worship. Artemis is the goddess known under various different names. For example, in Corinth, sometimes I would refer to as Artemis in Corinth, but in Corinth they usually went more with like Isis or Astarte, but those are the same names for Artemis. Artemis is the goddess, okay, and she has different names depending on the different areas you're in. But in Ephesus, she was known as Artemis. And if you read all of chapter 19 here in Acts, you see a big riot breaks out. So what basically happens is there's a revival, a whole bunch of people who are men and women who are worshiping Artemis, the goddess Artemis. What did they worship her via? Magic. And they had their books of curious arts. So sorcery, magic. And so a big thing happened. A whole bunch of those people got saved. And so then they took their witchcraft books, which is what it was, and they burned them publicly. I did the same thing after I got saved. So they took their books of magic and they burned them publicly. Then you read, as you continue reading on, a big riot breaks out. All these people who are pro-Artemis, right? And they're afraid that all these Christians are going to ruin the whole Artemis idol trade. So they start this big riot. They're chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Okay? So chapter 19 is fascinating to read. Recall, this is happening where Timothy's church was. These are 100% related. So Periergos is in the Bible twice. Both times it's in Ephesus. So we have Periergos, magic, being here in Acts 19:19, and we have Periergos being mistranslated as busybodies, killing the reference and the connection back in 1 Timothy 5:13. And this is a problem because it obscures a very important doctrine. Now, one, you might be thinking, well, what's this Artemis worship in these books of magic? Is it still happening today? 100%. What do we call this today? We have a name. This is a religion, and we have a name for it. It's called Wicca. So, the Wiccans will say that their religion is ancient and older than Christianity. Well, a lot of religions are ancient and older than Christianity because we had to have Christ born first before we could become followers of Christ. So, a religion being older does not make it true. Christians follow the same God that the Jews follow, which is Yahweh. Yahweh literally means the self-existent one. Okay, so this is talking about Wicca, if we're going to put it into modern day terms. And so a whole bunch of people who practice Wicca, the great goddess of Wicca is Artemis. And some people will call her Isis, Aphrodite. The Bible elsewhere also refers to as Ashtoreth or Ashtaroth. Same woman, same goddess. Okay? So these people here in Acts 19:19, they are burning their books. Okay? They practiced magic. Periergos. So now we flip back over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13, and we find out that gossip doesn't mean gossips. It means that they're speaking foolishness. And we find out that busybodies doesn't mean busybodies. It means magic. So now let's put these together. If we were to translate verse 13 even more literally and accurately, what would it say? Besides that, they learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house, and they are not merely idle, but also speakers of foolish things and magic, saying what they should not say. So now we have a triple reference. We have, first of all, the first two references being this is tying the false teachings of Wicca from Acts chapter 19 in Ephesus with the false teachings of Wicca also occurring by some of the women in Timothy's church, which was in Ephesus, which was a center of Wicca, Artemis worship. And then the third tie-in is now that is explaining the infamous verse, 1 Timothy 2:12. And I have a video on that. In 1 Timothy 2:12, it's talking about, have you ever noticed how after verse 12 it goes on and talks about Adam and Eve and then the husband and wife, and that if they're loyal in their faith to God, then the wife's curse of childbearing is lifted from her? That all goes together because it's referring to, it says, and Eve was deceived. So Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, and then she spiritually misled Adam to do the same thing. What are these women in Ephesus doing? So read here in verse 13. They're going house to house teaching Wicca. They are spiritually misleading people. 1 Timothy 2:12 is saying to the wife, don't spiritually mislead your husband as Eve spiritually misled Adam, or even as these young widows are going house to house spiritually misleading people. Okay, so that's the problem, is these young widows, they had all this time on their hands. They started getting all into this Artemis stuff, and then they're spreading the Artemis magic. They're going house to house teaching Wicca to others. So what's the resolution to that problem with these young widows? Verse 14. And that says, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households, as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. As to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. In other words, they're not giving room for the adversary to be in their life if their life is filled with doing good and what they should be doing. So he's saying, you're young. Get remarried. have children, raise your children, and take care of your house. Now, is this saying that women are supposed to be housewives? That they're supposed to bring their husbands their slippers every day? Is that what it means when it says manage their households? See, this is interesting because where it says manage their households, elsewhere in the Bible, that word, and that's the Greek word oikodespoteo, it's not translated manage their households. It's translated ruler or master of the house. So the Young's Literal Translation will say mistress of the house, and that was meant as in a female master. But it literally means master, not manager. So basically it doesn't mean boss, supervisor, employee. It doesn't mean you're the supervisor and then you have employees. It means you're the boss. It means you are the ruler of your household. Explosion, right? What? The woman is the ruler of her household? Yes. Did you know the Bible teaches that both the husband and the wife are to rule their household, not just the husband? So much for head of the household, right? And remember, if you're going to get into the head verses of, for example, Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 11, recall head, Greek kephale, did not mean authority. It meant source or beginning of. And I have videos on that in my Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 11 videos. So they are the masters of their household. Now, an example of one of the places where this Greek word is translated properly is in Matthew 10:25. So if we flip over to Matthew 10:25, and it's a long verse, let's just look at the second part of the verse. And it says, if they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So here we see the master of the house being referred to as his. I don't know if his is actually, I didn't look and see if that pronoun's in the Greek or not, but it doesn't matter because the Bible refers to householders and rulers and masters of the houses. You'll see it being used of both men and women. So this is talking about women being the masters of their households. So now we flip back over to 1 Timothy, and now let's look at verses 13 and 14 with more accurate Greek. All right, and it says, besides that, they learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house. And they're not merely idle, but also speakers of foolishness and magic, saying what they should not say. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and rule their households, so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. So now they're doing what's right. They are being fruitful and multiplying. They're ruling their households. Now, part of ruling their households meant that they're managing all of the servants. Women weren't these, perfect, prim little Stepford wives, homemakers. They had servants, and they ruled over their servants. And then they also were to, as the Bible instructs in other places, them along with their husband rule over their children and raise them up in the Lord. All right, now let's skip over to verses 16 and 17 because this has a gem in it that most people just seem to read right on past it and miss it. But remember the transitions in this chapter? Verses 1 and 2, respect your elders, referring to older people, and that transitions into verses 3 through 17, which talks about the treatment of widows. And then verse 17 talks about the treatment of widowed pastor women, and then it transitions from that into the treatment of all pastors or elders or presbyters, right? So verses 16 and 17. Now, some Bibles will end a paragraph after verse 16 and start a new paragraph at verse 17, and that is incorrect. The NRSV UE is correct in keeping them in the same paragraph. So verses 16 and 17 say, if any believing woman have relatives who are widows, let her assist them. Let the church not be burdened so that it can assist those who are real widows. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. First of all, verse 16, a believing woman, is she supposed to assist the widows of her household? How can a woman assist the widows of her household? Well, we just read in verse 14 that the wife is the ruler of her household. That means she should have fully capacity to allocate funds to the widow, to send over servants to help the widow, to help provide clothing and food for the widow. Okay, and then verse 17. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. Did this suddenly jump out of nowhere with no transition to quick subject change with no transition? We're going to stop talking about widows and now we're just going to go into church elders and pastors. And as a lot of people wrongly believe, the patriarchalists are like, whoops, we just jumped to men pastors now. No transition. Boom. Sudden subject change. No context for the subject change. That's jarring. That's because that's not what it says. When the scripture isn't flowing and you're putting a meaning to something and it's not flowing, the meaning you're putting to it is wrong. Literally, go with the flow. What's the transitional flow here? It's talking about women widows. And then verse 18, it has transitioned into how pastors are worthy of their work, right? But verse 17 is transitioning. It's talking about women pastors. Now the word elders here, it's the Greek word presbyteros, and it's where we get presbytery from. And we'll see in the New Testament that elders or presbyteros is used synonymously and interchangeably with overseers or bishops. So an elder or an overseer or a bishop is comparable to what we would call a pastor today. A deacon is what would be comparable to what we would call a minister or a preacher today. A minister or a preacher can be a pastor, but they are not necessarily a pastor of one church, but they could be. Timothy was, Phoebe was, but they're also more likely to also go to other churches and other venues to preach and teach as well. As to where an elder, bishop, or overseer is usually the pastor of one church, that is their home base. They're building that church. It tends to be a bigger church, and instead of them going out and preaching and teaching elsewhere, there will usually be a sending church that will send others to go out as preachers and ministers to preach and teach elsewhere. So here we have women, widowed, presbytery. These are pastors. And it says that they rule well. Now the word rule here, this is not oikodespoteo. This is a different word. The word rule here is from proistemi. Now this is in the verb form of proistemi. But the Bible talks about a woman preacher of a specific church who was a ruler, and including being a ruler of Paul the Apostle himself. And so as a ruler or leader, now that's no longer going to be a verb. That's now a title, which is a noun. And so it uses the feminine noun version of proistemi. And the feminine noun version in Greek of proistemi is prostatis. So we see this in Romans chapter 16. So if you turn with me to Romans chapter 16, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. The word benefactor there, some Bibles will say patron or patroness or helper or succorer. What? That's prostatis. That's the noun for leader or ruler. It's the same word that was translated as the verb rule for the elders of the church that we just read in 1 Timothy 5:17. Why is it saying benefactor here? That's incorrect. It literally means ruler. So now if we read these two verses correctly, we have, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a ruler or leader of many, and of myself as well. The Young's literal translation and the Passion translation both correctly translate prostatis here as leader, which is 100% correct. It would be like in English, if there was a man over there and he was going to lead a Bible study. So then we'll say, oh yeah, Bert, he's going to lead the Bible study. That's the verb form of lead. But now we have a woman, and she's from another church, and she is a leader of the Bible study of that church. Now that's lead in the noun form. But it's referring to a woman, so we better not say leader. Let's say helper. She helps with the Bible study at the church. No, he leads in the study. She is a leader in the study. It doesn't change just because it went from a verb to a noun, that as a verb it means to lead, but when it's a noun, suddenly it's the exact opposite, and it means one who helps or is being led. That's complete balderdash. Now, I will do a future video on Phoebe, but we still have quite a few other scriptures that I want to go through first. But now if we jump back to 1 Timothy chapter 5, we see that verse 17, we see a couple of key words or phrases here so that we know it's referring to widowed women pastors. Okay, one, it says, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. Rule well. Phoebe ruled and taught at the church in Cenchreae, was a ruler of many. She even ruled over Paul the apostle himself. So we see that that can apply to women. And then we have the key phrase. It says, worthy of double honor. Where did we see that? Verse 3. Honor widows. It says in verse 3. Then verse 17, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. It's still talking about the widows. See, first it talks about, okay, so, this is how you're going to care for, this is, the young widows, they should get remarried and have children. Okay, the older widows, their family is supposed to take care of them. But if they don't have family to take care of them, then the church is supposed to take care of them. And widows who are pastors, they get double honor. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. Verse 3, honor widows, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. So these are the women who are the opposite of the women in verse 13. The women in verse 13 are teaching Wicca. The women in verse 17 are preaching and teaching the Word of God, such as Phoebe did in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 2. So wrapping this up, when we really look at this in context, we look at this, that this was all happening in Ephesus, with Periergos and the teaching of magic and the massive Wicca, basically, is what was going on there. This was just pre-Wicca, Wicca, right? So there were false teachings of Wicca. So we saw that women were going around teaching false teachings about Wicca or Artemis worship, and that we see that that was a problem, that the women in the church were misleading their husbands towards Wicca as well. And that's why if you look at it in actual Greek in 1 Timothy 2:12, it's saying that the woman is not to spiritually mislead her husband in such a way that leads to a spiritual death. Because the word there, authority, is not translated authority. Because it's translated authority there, but it doesn't mean authority. It's authenteo, and authenteo is not anywhere else in the Bible, but it is in the Apocrypha, where it is properly translated as murder, and that's literally what authenteo means. Because after Eve spiritually misled Adam, he died. He died spiritually, and then he eventually died physically. He no longer was living forever in his physical body, as was the original plan, as will be the plan again when we get the tree back again, as we read about in Revelation. Okay, so this is what it was talking about. So 5:13 is tying in with 1 Timothy 2:12, which is tying in with Acts 19:19. It doesn't say that women aren't allowed to teach men. It's saying that the wives are not to be spiritually misleading their husbands, which can lead to their spiritual death like Eve did to Adam, or just like the young widows are doing, going house to house teaching Wicca. All right, and then we see that women aren't, the little lady at home bringing her husband slippers. They were the rulers of their households, the masters of their households. And then we see that both men and women are pastors in the church. We see verse 17, where it's specifically saying, okay, here is how to handle the widowed women pastors who ruled well, same word as where Phoebe was a leader or a ruler, and who taught and preached the word of God. That, as in verse 3, to honor widows. Verse 17, women pastors, well, they get double honor. So I hope you enjoyed this study. I hope you will continue joining me in this series. If you haven't watched the past videos, well, if you've watched me this far, you clearly have an attention span, so you might be interested in those past videos. Have a blessed day.